So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As I was waiting for more of you to come in, many of you who are already in the room said, let's start. We'll have a little bit more time for discussions. So if that's okay with you, we'll just start. And I'm going to call the first speaker up to help set the scene very shortly. Welcome to the session on odds and ends of rehabilitating or restoring degraded landscapes with agroforestry. It's an odd title, and you might be wondering, why we've got such a title. Well, if you think about the grand plans that we are talking about here at the Landscape Forum or across town in COP, at the COP venues, what they often miss are the small details. What they often miss is that you do not restore, you do not change anything unless you are on a farmer's plot, in a village, in a city, in a ministry, in a cabinet. It's those details that matter. And from the perspective that we are taking today, in the kind of landscapes that we're interested in, where agroforestry plays a role, it is a critical decision for a farmer. It's a risky decision for a farmer to decide what tree will they plant, which livestock would they feed from that tree, and what crops would they grow. Those are the small decisions that change landscapes. Some recent research of colleagues of mine at the World Agroforestry Center suggests that over 30 years in Kenya, the biggest investor in restoring landscapes was not the government of Kenya, was not any global facility. It was small farmers planting trees in their backyards. The odds and ends of agroforestry, ladies and gentlemen, is what we're talking about. My name is Ravi Prabhu, and I work for the World Agroforestry Center. It is my privilege to present today a very distinguished panel, but we will start off with a young colleague of mine who's been working quite seriously on this, whose challenge it is to challenge you, to think a little bit beyond the large canvas down to the fine details. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Lalisa Duguma, who will set the keynote for today. Lalisa is an upcoming star from Ethiopia working on climate change and restoration. Lalisa, please come up.
Thank you so much, Ravi, for the very nice introduction. As he said, the title is a bit looking strange, but strange things could actually be some answers if we discuss on it very seriously. So I'll be talking about odds and ends of rehabilitating or restoring degraded landscapes. Just a quick outline of my presentation. I'll give a brief background. Then we go into the big questions that we need to deal with when we talk about restoration or rehabilitation. Those are, what do we want to achieve? We say a lot, we talk a lot, and we mention a lot about restoration, but what are we targeting? The second one is, how do we want to reach at what we are talking about? What are the things we need to follow? What are the processes? And the third is, why do we do it actually? That's another interesting perspective. Whose voice and choice is crucial? Because we are not just doing restoration for fun, we are doing for a purpose, and who are the targets that we are addressing in that specific stakeholders that we need to take into account. It's not just about the question. Then at the end, I will have a case study that could actually illustrate what I am talking about when we discuss the 4 questions, and then I'll have a summary. I really don't think we need to go too much into why we need the restoration, why the restoration agenda is increasingly gaining momentum and so on, because the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report, for example, highlighted 60% of the ecosystem services widely used by humanity are degraded or being used unsustainably. But we rely on ecosystems for our daily survival. So thinking about restoring or rehabilitating the potential of the ecosystem to deliver these ecosystem services is crucial for humanity. This is a very nice and a very good graph which I took from the IUCN, and it shows where we have the strong restoration potentials. And though mainly the focus is on the degraded lands and forest aspects, I think it gives us a good perspective when we want to look at where we have the potentials. There are 3 different types according to the IUCN. The first one is the mosaic restoration, where we have forests intermingled with smallholder production systems, agroforestry, settlement areas, and so on. We have about 1.5 billion hectares for that. The second type is the wide-scale restoration, which is more on the closed system type or closed forest aspect, and we have about 0.5 billion. The third is, which is a bit difficult to do, but where we have still a great potential, is the remote area forests where there is, which is actually unpopulated. It's about 0.2 billion hectares. So looking at these potentials, opportunities, countries are making commitments to benefit from the restoration-related activities. And the main and the very good example from that perspective is the Bond Challenge, or the forest landscape restoration. And my country and the United States are leading in this line, and we hope some other countries will take over them soon. And we have about 15 million hectares, both for Ethiopia and USA each. That means they make up 30 million of the pledged. And a number of countries are actually getting into the picture because there is a great potential behind this restoration agenda. Okay, this is very promising. We really congratulate those countries who made the pledge. But when we begin to go into the implementation phase, what are the things we need to critically look at? Those 4 questions I have projected earlier, those are very critical if we want to make restoration or rehabilitation successful and sustainable. Just to take you a little bit into the discourse between restoration and rehabilitation, I mean, when we look at the impact we want, it does not matter too much, but when we think about the details, it matters a bit, because restoration is the recovery of a lost system, but rehabilitation is largely looking at the reparation of the functions, the ecosystem processes. This is according to the Society of Ecological Restoration, which is a premier produced by them. So restoration is more looking into the return of an ecosystem to its historic trajectory, while rehabilitation is not necessarily going back, but taking us into the context that could actually provide the necessary functions. So going into my key questions, the first one is, what are we intending to restore or rehabilitate? Especially when we talk about forest restoration or rehabilitation, is it about the cover or the quality? Because the cover can mean just land, the areas that could be occupied by forest. The quality could actually mean, what do those forests provide as services and benefits? That's what describes the quality when we talk about forest restoration, for example. We have a number of countries where we have good examples where forest cover is increasing, but it is not about the quality, it is about the cover. So we need to think, what do we want to achieve? Is it about the cover or the quality? What is the landscape we want to have? This is another question. I mean, we say restoration or rehabilitation, but do we have a vision what we want to achieve? Where are we going, and where are we going to finish our process or program or project? Because if we don't have a vision of where we are going, we probably may miss the target. And we may miss sustainability indicators from which we are going to evaluate the projects. And in looking at what we are going to achieve, history is very important because it provides the reference point. Context is very critical because it provides the local realities within which the activities are going to take place. Risks and drivers of change are crucial because they define how the evolution over time is going to take place. Which pathway or trajectory is appropriate? Because we can have different ways of reaching at what we want to achieve. But which one is appropriate? Because we have a number of safeguards issues in place. The social aspects are there, the environmental aspects are there, and a number of variables that we need to evaluate are there. So how do we want to go where we plan to be in restoring or rehabilitating the degraded landscapes? And because each pathway can have its own distinct set of practices, investments, stakeholders who are interested, and others who could be engaged. So how do we go about it is one critical thing. And the next one is, from whose perspective do we do restoration actually? When we think about a landscape, it is involving a number of stakeholders or actors actually. They could be outside the landscape, but they could influence the landscape. There are those who are very active in the landscape, those who are engaged in a daily activities within the landscape. So who makes a decision on what has to be achieved? And the next one is, do we capture the voice of everyone who is really engaged, who is really active in that landscape? And whose vision is it? Because if we are imposing our vision on the landscape, those who are living in the landscape might not always agree to what we propose, because we have a different set of thinking, but they have their own set of living conditions based on which they define their vision of tomorrow. What is the voice of the people when it comes to the choice of practices, choice of tree species, the nature of benefits generated? Because the benefits that are generated has to be reaching the whole people that are active in the process, and sometimes we actually benefit from what they do out there. This is a nice quote I got from the Delta Electronics Group. Their booth is at the COP21. It says, we are not here to rebuild what we have lost. We are here to build the future, because the future takes into account the dynamics that might be possible to happen, the changing, the drivers of change, and a lot of things. And especially the voice of the people who will be like us tomorrow, the youth, the women, who usually we do not care very much about. So I asked a lot of questions, but now I try to show you what has happened in one of the landscapes in Tanzania. It's called Shinyanga region. Maybe we have some Tanzanian colleagues here, I don't know, but it's a very good example of how this process has evolved over time. And the program ran from 1980s up to 2005, and I'll just show you quickly what has happened. The first one we need to understand is, what is the process? Where were we? What has happened during the degradation? And the restoration phase, what are the activities that were taking place? Before the degradation has begun to occur, there was a sustainable agro-pastoral livelihood system in that region. They have a fodder bank system which they use to feed their livestock. They have woodlands which they extracted fuel wood and construction materials from. But due to a disease which is called tsetse fly, I don't know how many of us are aware about that, they began to clear the woodlands. When they began to clear the woodlands, they began to replace it with cash crops. This has resulted in increasing livestock population, which then resulted in overstocking. As a result, due to the number of factors that are in the degradation phase, the landscape has gotten to be close to become a desert. So the government has decided to take an action, and they established a HASHI program. This HASHI program is supported by a number of donors, number of government organizations, and ICRAF was one of the technical partners that was in the process from the beginning. So they designed a framework, they designed a process, they defined the practices that has to be part of the restoration or the rehabilitation scheme, especially making a strong focus on community empowerment. So the choice of practices that were involved, that were part of the restoration scheme, all were through consultative process. Some were actually traditional practices. The Ngitili, which is up in the restoration phase on the screen, is a local traditional fodder management system. So through the mix of all these things, they were able to grow areas that were only 611 hectares managed under the traditional fodder bank system in 1980s to about 400,000 hectares in 2005. I'll show you the details. This is one of the case study farmers in the areas that we visited. This house is actually built from the sale of honey, the sale of fuel wood, and grazing contracts that he used to practice in the restored Ngitilis. And below, what you see is the degraded grazing land that is still out there compared to the restored Ngitili system. So this is making a significant livelihood change, significant environmental change, and significant contribution to climate change mitigation, actually. So looking at the multiple functions, especially the social, the environmental, and livelihood benefits, this program has resulted in a series of benefits that has changed the system significantly. For example, the per capita income from the Ngitili system is about $168 US. But the rural expenditure of Tanzania, or the region where this study was conducted, is only 102. That means farmers are actually having a potential to save money where they are practicing this restoration scheme. We have a significant carbon sequestration potential in a place which was at the verge of becoming a desert. Now they have RED+ piloting programs. Biodiversity conservation, a number of mammal species and bird species have re-emerged. And this, for the local communities, it's a miracle that they see big mammals in their area now. From people we spoke to, it's having a significant impact. This is just a detailed breakdown of the benefits from the practice, from the restoration or rehabilitation scheme. Here, two ladies. The lady with the cape is actually called Mama Ngitili. Ngitili is a practice. And because she has been practicing this Ngitili from the early stage when they brought the system into action. So in all this process, the actors are very critical. Who were active in this whole scheme? We have local traditional institutions. We have local formal institutions. We have regional, national, and global institutions. I just want to focus on the local ones. For example, Dagashida is an informal institution which is engaged in decision-making about the Ngitili management or the restoration management. They organize cultural events where they share experience about resource management to the young and the middle-aged people. Sungu are like securing the community. They are part of the community. They do this securing of possessions of the community resources and so on. They also do law enforcement. And they have a number of groups. So it is all inclusive when we look at the local structures that are engaged. That means we have the youth in it, we have the women in it, we have the elders in it, we have the men in it. So it's an all-inclusive process where they have annual events of celebration and so on. And we see a number of international organizations like Norwegian government who was supporting financially. ICRAF was there from the beginning providing technical support. So what did actually lead to this success? The first one is multi-stakeholder engagement and institutional collaborations that actually provided the resources and knowledge that are required to manage the rehabilitation and the benefits from the scheme. Long-term investment, because these days we have projects for 5 years or 6 years, and when they phase out, everything phases out. But We need programs that run until the process gets to mature in a way that the community can take over the process. Favorable and supportive national and local policy processes. I've mentioned how the government has facilitated the resource mobilization scheme, establishing the right institutions, the right support mechanisms, use of local practices and knowledge. The main underlying foundation for this success is they used local practice, which is the Ngitili or the traditional fodder management system. This empowers the local community because when their knowledge is used and practiced, they feel value for it. The last one is empowering the community to take control of the process. Sometimes we go there, we do things, we get out, they know nothing. They have their little knowledge that they used to practice the way they do their things. But what we brought in, we left out without telling them anything in detail so that they can take control of the process. So empowering the local communities is critical. In summary, I think to achieve the goal of restoration or rehabilitation for degraded landscapes, we need to ask ourselves these major questions. What do we want to achieve? We need to articulate our vision very properly, together with the community, together with the actors in the landscape, together with actors that can influence the landscape. How do we want to do it? This is a process that involves serious consultation, serious engagement of the local communities, and serious opinion from them too. Who should be engaged? This is still again about the actors, and why do we do it? That's also the key question we need to ask ourselves, and we need to have a right answer for a number of such kinds of questions so that we could actually make it a success, not just a project that runs for a few years and stops and it phases out, but something that is sustainable and continues to prosper the local community. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lalisa. Thanks for setting the scene so well. And to take this forward, ladies and gentlemen, we have a very distinguished panel who are going to share their perspectives from very different contexts on how we could move forward with the restoration agenda that includes agroforestry. But just so that everybody understood, and I think it came out from the presentation, agroforestry is not just about planting trees. It's about a whole system. It was, in that case, as much as important to get the grazing lands up and running, back into productivity, and trees was a means to get there, as it was for croplands and livestock management. So without further ado, let me invite first to take a seat, Stuart McGuinness. He is the Global Director of the Nature-Based Solutions Group at IUCN. But Stuart, you're actually the grandfather of all of this, aren't you? And you've got the gray hair to show for it. Stuart started working on this well before anybody else started doing this. And, you know, I can remember Stuart jubilating when the landscapes, forest landscapes restoration agenda started coming up. Stuart, you're more than welcome up here. I would like to invite Shantanu Mathur from the International Fund for Agricultural Development. Shantanu nowadays spends his time between the Rome-based development agencies. He's got 35 years of experience. I like to think of Shantanu as Mr. Moneybags, but he'll tell you why investments and the kinds of investments that IFAD and the other partners are making, long-term investments, as I think Lalisa has asked us to think about, are important. Real pleasure to invite Joanna Durbin up. Joanna is the director of the Climate, Community and Biodiversity Alliance. Joanna has been really instrumental in helping to develop the standards for RED, particularly the social and environmental standards, She's been a tireless campaigner for improving the way we address REDD and now restoration as well. Jonah, you're more than welcome to join us. I would like to also now invite, it's a real pleasure to invite Sarwono Kusumaatmadja. Sarwono, are you in the audience? Please join us. Sarwono has been a minister for many, many years in Indonesia. He is now the chair of the Indonesian Climate Change, a National Climate Change Advisory Council, and brings a host of wisdom to this panel. So welcome, Sarwono. Next up, from the other side of the world, from Peru, Mr. Gustavo Suarez de Freitas. Gustavo, as I said, is from Peru. He is the executive coordinator of the National Program for Forest Conservation in the Ministry of Environment in Peru. He has had various distinguished posts and comes to us with a real deep understanding from a Peruvian perspective of where we want to take the restoration agenda in that part of the world. From Ethiopia, and I hope I'm going to pronounce this right, Mr. Yigramachev Suyum, yeah, was that fair enough? The Director of Policy and the Forestry Director, please come up and join us. And he is with the Ministry of Environment and Forest and Climate Change Ethiopia, and brings from the country that has pledged 15 million hectares to restoration a really important agenda. Now, I'm a little embarrassed because we have a very distinguished seventh panelist for whom a chair is just emerging. Most of you know him in the room, ladies and gentlemen, the UN CCD Drylands Ambassador, Dennis Garrity, a tireless champion of the evergreen agriculture and restoration agendas. You're welcome to sit wherever you want, Dennis. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the panel. What we're going to try and do is make certain that all of these extremely knowledgeable people don't eat up all your time. So I'm going to try and keep them to 5 minutes each, and I'm going to ask Stuart to start off with set a really good example, Stuart. And then we're going to come back to you and open the floor for a discussion with all of you, and then hopefully understand that by the end of the session, the richness of this agenda, try and take the restoration agenda to where it really belongs, a defining agenda for our time. Stuart, help us to set the scene.
Okay, thank you very much, Ravi. And really what I've got to say really just builds on that fantastic presentation by Lalisa. I thought it really captured everything and set us off on a very good basis. So very quickly, what we know is that 20% of cultivated land is degraded, or is at least is working at a suboptimal level of functionality. And this impacts 1.4 billion people. The figure I didn't realize until this morning, actually in the previous session, that this actually has a cost of 5% of global GDP. I mean, just think of that, that is significant. In the context of climate change, which is obviously why several of us find ourselves in Paris, remember what Nick Stern estimated, that to address the impacts of climate change would be about somewhere around 1% of GDP. Now we know land use and land management can't do it all. We need to see significant deep cuts in fossil fuel emissions. But there is a fundamental linkage here that we have got and I think it stresses again this fact that when we deal with land use for climate change, we've got to be thinking of all the other benefits. And as I said in the last session, please stop using this word co-benefits. They're not co-benefits. They're fundamental benefits for people's livelihoods, for maintaining productivity, for maintaining biodiversity. They work in tandem with our efforts on climate change. If we hit the Bond Challenge target, we reckon we could potentially deliver 1 gigaton of CO2 equivalent for each year. Now that is, again, that doesn't solve the climate problem, but it makes a relatively good contribution. So with respect to agroforestry then, here are 4 key messages that I would like to leave behind, and I really do sort of think that they just reinforce what Lalisa said. Number 1, agroforestry is, without any equivocation, central to delivering forest landscape restoration and achieving the Bond Challenge. A quick anecdote, if I've got time, Ravi. Dennis came up when we launched the Bond Challenge and said, I'll tell you what, Stuart, I'll give you a third of that. Well, Dennis, I'm sorry, a third's not enough. I actually think we can actually go further than that. In fact, I think if we realize the potential of agroforestry, we will actually exceed that. And just an example of that, in Rwanda, where we've been working recently, which of course is intuitive, makes sense. If Rwanda goes to achieve its ambitions around landscape restoration, agroforestry will contribute at least 1/2 of the effort. Number 2, that one of the things we have to address that is really holding us back is the failure to ensure interagency prioritization and collaboration among government land use agencies. This is still a fundamental issue. Agroforestry still falls between 2 stools. Who owns it? Who's going to set and drive the tree technology? Who's going to help move that forward? Often we see, and many of you know this, that when it gets down to this issue, we end up more with bickering of who agroforestry belongs, rather than the real potential that agroforestry can deliver. So this is one governance issue that we've really got to set straight. We've got to find ways and institutional arrangements in government agencies that drive agroforestry forward. And the thing is, if we don't do that, that will cause a disincentive for the investments we say we want. We want to see the private sector invest, but how are they going to invest if we actually don't have clarity of a framework on how that can be delivered? Message number 3 is we already have the tools and the know-how and the science. We've got it thanks to ICRAF. We know we've got good tree technologies. They're out there and they're proven for different situations. We also know how to establish farmer preferences, as Lalisa talked to. A farmer's not just going to plant any old tree. They want particular trees in particular locations at particular configurations. But we also know how to work with farmers to identify those preferences. And we've now can systematically actually identify, look at the landscape and actually identify and reconcile what the priorities are, how we get packages working together from ecological restoration to agroforestry to plantations to soil and water stabilization, how we can get those working together through tools, methodological frameworks like the Restoration Opportunity Assessment methodology that IUCN and WRI have developed. And then the final message comes back actually to the final message that Lalisa highlighted as well, that the involvement of stakeholders is absolutely fundamental. And here I want to emphasize particularly the role of women. Now, we know there is this figure, 60 to 80% of agricultural productivity in developing countries is in the hands of women. We also know that that's contested. But what we do know as a fact is that 79% of economically active women in developing countries list agriculture as their primary activity. So we've got to be able to listen to this. Farmers know what they want. They know what they know what their needs are, but we've got to be able to talk to them, as Lalisa said, and identify that. And if I've got time, have I got time just to give one more anecdote?
Just about.
As very recently, as I was working in Rwanda, I came across this fantastic work of a young researcher there. I'm sure connected with ICRAF, a chap called Charles Buchaga, and he did a study on farmers' preference. And what he came up with, he said, farmers know the trees they want. They know the trees that they need. But the very fact is they're not just going to plant eucalyptus and grevillea, which are the only trees on offer. So I think this is one of the things we really do need to do. We need to get stakeholders involved, and we need to be able to develop the tree technology packages and provide the institutional support around their needs. And then, as Ravi highlighted right at the start, then all these odds and ends of agroforestry truly will change landscapes. Thanks.
Thanks, Stuart. Shantanu?
Okay, let me take the cue right from the last thing you said, Stuart. I'm glad that Ravi dwelt a little bit also on this wonderfully intriguing topic, odds and ends. Usually one considers these things as miscellaneous. It's difficult to get a handle on these. They don't fit very well into a structure. But let me paraphrase that a little bit and call them loose ends that need to be tied, especially because there are context-specific situations where there's a whole gamut of policy issues, institutional issues, technological issues that impinge on the adaptability and adoptability of sustainable agricultural technologies like agroforestry and evergreen agriculture that we're talking about. Now, I was going to raise maybe a couple of clusters of issues here. One, I think, is important, and that is the incentive structure. Lalisa has kind of dwelt on that too in your very brilliant presentation. Thank you very much. And about funding, because Ravi challenged me perhaps to speak a little bit on that. So, in the context of incentive structure, why do I talk about it? Because I think there is a private cost that the farmers do incur for societal gain here. That's extremely important. And since we are on anecdotes, maybe, yesterday there was a wonderful session in which evergreen agriculture was writ large. This was the European Union and IFAD reporting on some successful technologies. And the commissioner from the EU talked about the last mile to the farm gate. And Tony Simons, the Director General of ICRAF, in fact, converted that into 1.6 kilometers. Very important for some of us Eurocentric people to understand or get a sense of the distances involved. But, you know, that last mile could well be a mile too far. And often, you know, you find Danone or some other private sector setting up a factory with very attractive paychecks, etc. And somehow the opportunity, the labor opportunity cost, you know, of conservation agriculture, conservation-based agriculture becomes extremely high, and you lose out. So, you know, conservation-based agriculture then become notoriously difficult in terms of adoptability. There are other issues that drive the incentive structure. You've got land tenure, access, ownership, in community-based natural resource management projects. You have issues of conflict resolution, etc., some of which Lalisa did talk about. Let me get to my second point on financing. There's another set of challenges there. IFAD, for instance, is not really a donor, but a development partner. And our development projects, I mean, one would classify them more as investment projects. And they have to be viable, both in economic and financial terms. You know, the economic internal rate of return must be, you know, roughly at least equal to or greater than your opportunity cost of capital. But the problem is that seldom do cost-benefit analyses, and you know, when they're practiced, take into account environmental costs and benefits. So talk about a technology like evergreen agriculture. We don't take into account when we generate an incremental benefit stream, the gestation period for these trees to come on board and start generating multiple benefits. At the same time, we never take into account the mitigation benefits coming from trees at all into consideration. IFAD's financed a large number of such environmental projects, and in Africa we have a large number of a whole graveyard of failures, I must say. So,
Shantanu, we don't want you to stop on that negative note, so give us some hope.
So the hope here, if I have 15 more seconds maybe,
15 seconds it
is that if you are going to invest in the challenges of meeting these odds and ends, etc., you got to be patient. You got to learn some of these hard lessons, and you got to be there in the long haul. Let's put it that way, because we've been with ICRAF in financing some of these outstanding successes for the past 30 years at least, and now we are coming to fruition there.
Thank
So
you.
more later, maybe.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you.
very much. Joanna.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be on the panel, and thank you, Lalisa, for the presentation. I appreciate that you picked up on the importance of who is involved and who decides, and I'd like to kind of stress that even more, just from my experiences. So we are a group of NGOs, and we've been developing standards for social and environmental standards for forest carbon, or land-based carbon, actually much more broad than just forests. And we provide a framework that we facilitated a process for stakeholders to define a framework of what criteria and indicators would define quality and provide assurances. And these standards, they're being used. The CCB standards, the Climate, Community and Biodiversity standards, are very widely used in the voluntary market, and they're used because there are specific concerns and huge multiple benefits that can come from all kinds of land use change. But there are obviously risks. There are risks for people and risks for biodiversity. And so having a framework helps to provide those assurances. So from 2009, we started to develop standards, REDD+ social and environmental standards for government-led programs of policies and measures for REDD+. And we, instead of developing a framework that would then be assessed by independent auditors coming from the outside, it became clear that the standards, although we could, through an international process, identify some important issues like respect for the rights and knowledge of indigenous peoples and local communities or whatever, actually what's important in the country itself has to be defined by the stakeholders within the country. And also defining quality assurance, have those standards been met, can be done through a robust, participatory, transparent process. It doesn't need to be checked from outside. People from outside can see it's been a good process, so then they can see the transparency and start to feel more confidence, and with a strong grievance mechanism as well. So after we started that initiative, the Cancun safeguards were adopted by the UNFCCC COP and are applied to REDD+ programs, but they're just very broad statements. So actually this process of countries facilitating a process of communities and NGOs and private sector coming together to define their own standards is a very powerful process. And we recently did a survey of outcomes in 10 countries from countries developing their own safeguards process. And we found that 84% of those outcomes, 136 outcomes from 10 countries, are to do with important steps that government and civil society have made to be more participatory. It's quite interesting that with the idea that those are behavior changes that will ultimately lead to improved livelihoods, improved biodiversity, etc. So I suppose I want to make the case for safeguards and standards as a way, not an international imposition, but it's a mechanism that a country or a community can use to define their own vision of where they want to go and what they want to protect, what they want to see achieved in terms of multiple benefits, and we have a really interesting example from Nepal, where I was visiting recently. We were taken to one of the 18,000 community forestry user groups. It was run entirely by women, and these women were managing the forest for the community. And they're kept on their toes by the community, who are sort of making sure that they deliver what's good for the community, and those kinds of initiatives with women taking responsibility and finding their own motivation, and then being rewarded for that, have been a great model. And the people that we went with to visit that, several of them I know, one from DRC went back and that was very motivated to explain that to communities in DRC. So one point I want to make, maybe my last point, is a true multi-stakeholder process is a very courageous thing to do. It's not just something that governments have to be willing to do to open up to communities and others. Communities, and we were talking actually earlier today to indigenous peoples groups about developing standards for their own indigenous projects, and it's quite a big step for them to actually include government in their process. And in Nepal, for example, those women taking initiative in communities has support from government, such that government has now developed a policy that for all those community forest user groups, at least 50% of the committees should be women. Yeah. So it's sort of interesting where you see, step by step, incrementally, through a multi-stakeholder process, you can build this more an approach where you have a shared vision and support from government, support from communities, and you achieve large-scale rehabilitation, I hope, and restoration.
Yeah, Joanne, it's so true. Shantanu referred to a session yesterday over in the Blue Zone of the COP where we discussed some of these issues. And as it so happens, we have Purity Gashanga here with us. She's the leader of a women's farmer group in Kenya, 168 women. Her message to the two governors of counties sitting over there is that we're not going to listen to you. You're not welcome because you haven't helped us. But we are helping ourselves. And over the 20 years that she's been doing agriculture and feeding her 11 children on 1.5 hectares, the amount of restoration that she has done out of her own investment is simply incredible. Purity, could you just wave to the crowd? And with that, I'd like to make a step change and get to the countries, and we'll start with Asia and Sarwono. Your 5 minutes, sir, starts now.
Thank you, Mr. Prabhu. I hope I will consume less than that. And I will not be dealing with the technicalities of climate change and all that, because I'm sitting here with an audience of experts, so I'll just point out the non-technical things that is worth mulling over. The first is that the most successful social forestry program that occurs in Indonesia occurs in Java. Java comprises of only 7% of our land mass, but it is also home to close to 45% of the population, which in total is about 250 million. Mm-hmm. So what we see is a lot of people practicing social forestry on small plots of land. And their approach is consistent with our profile as a mega biodiversity country. That's the first I'd like to point out. The second is that most of the unsustainable businesses which has suffered the boom and bust situations are large estates outside of Java. There's plenty of land there, But I think unwittingly, because at that time we didn't know very much about climate change, it was the wrong decision by the private sector as well as the government to establish vast estates with homogeneous plants. So we have had the boom and bust situation in rubber. It was boom in the 50s because of the geopolitical situation at that time, but it went bust. And then we had a boom in timber and plywood. We used to be the biggest exporter of those two commodities. And for obvious reasons, they also went bust. The next wave is we were dreaming of establishing huge rice estates. It failed before it began. Mm-hmm. And what is next? The next is a boom in palm oil. Now, palm oil is a hot issue in Indonesia nowadays. Fortunately, I think we're having a rethinking about palm oil in the sense that we no longer aspire to be the biggest palm oil exporter, but we try to make palm oil sustainable. Mm-hmm. So a lot of palm oil pledges are popping up now. This pop and that pop, and but I'm heartened by the fact that at least they're starting to use the right language. So I told them that the remaining thing to do for them would be to make themselves believable. And for some people, that's difficult. The second success story that I would like to point out is our scheme of ecosystem restoration. The Ministry of Forestry has issued about 13 permits for ecosystem restoration as investment program. I think Joanna knows about it because he personally knows one of the practitioners. I also know him because he's been in my household for more than 40 years. So at this time, 13 permits for ecosystem restoration companies have been issued, totaling more than 500,000 hectares. And with better regulation, which is now coming up, I think there's a lot of opportunity for that kind of business to be launched in Indonesia. But it needs a lot of conditions to be established in order for those investment types to be attractive. And as the advisor of climate change to the minister, I know that she's working now very hard to introduce institutional and regulatory changes that we need, in order for our agro businesses to be more sustainable and more in line with what is required in a world being threatened by climate change. Yeah. Now the next question is, will we succeed? Well, as somebody who has been in politics for more than 30 years, I would say that we have a reason to be optimistic that we will succeed. The first reason is that we're going.
We need to come back to all the reasons during the question answer because the 5 minutes ticking. So
it's up now, yeah? Okay. Yeah. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for bringing us back to policy and the opportunities, because I think I can see Gustavo smiling because that was a good segue for him from a Peruvian perspective, perhaps.
Well, thank you. Well, I wish to say very quick points. No? The first is that we are working our national forest and climate change strategy. For us, agroforestry is clearly an important part of the strategy to avoid deforestation. Because in my country, most of the deforestation in the Amazon happens, is done by people who came from other ecosystems, migrant people, and these people, how should you say, occupy land, no? And the government is not in the possibility to control all the areas, so the people is more or less an open resources, so the open access resources. Mm-hmm. So the people go to the lands in the Amazon. But we have some numbers to show the problem. No? More or less, we already deforested more or less 8 million hectares in the Amazon. 80% of that in lands without agriculture capacity, forest lands or protection lands. So there are a lot of candidates for restoration, because the possibility to maintain the good use of the soil in these lands is very, very low. And also, the area each person or each farmer cut every year is less than 3 hectares, 1 to 3 hectares. 70% of the cleared area is cleared in these small patches. Mm-hmm. No? And also, these people has very low technology, and very low profit for the use of the land. No? So they are also they try to. It's impossible for them to maintain the soil fertility, so they deplete the soil and move to another area. No? So we need to change this pattern in order to avoid deforestation in the country. And the best way is to improve the use of the already deforested areas. No? Mm-hmm. That is the core of the idea of our strategy. But then we need to not only to have technical capacities, but also we need to have the financial capacity to work in a very large area to make a transformational change in the way they use the land. It's not an easy task, because the country don't have the amount of money we need for that, and even cooperation is small for the amount of money we need. No? So we are trying to design models to allow us to link small farmers with more with investors, with the private sector, in a way that they can help us to improve the productivity, help the people to fix in the areas, and promote a better life for the people in these areas in order to avoid this migratory process over the forest. No? Restoration then is very important for our strategy, and agroforestry also is one of the tools we can use to this restoration. Of course, we also can make plantations, but we believe agroforestry is probably the better choice, because we need to maintain the people in the land. No? We are trying to avoid these models of large plantations who move the people, because we can produce a lot of leakage. No? So we need investments which are inclusive, which are competitive, and which are sustainable. That is our goal. No? I know it's not easy, but that is what we think we need. Our new forestry law allows the government to grant land use contracts for the people who are in areas which are not from agricultural land, because in our country the property rights are only allowed in agricultural lands, not in forest lands or in protection lands. But there is the people living there, and thousands of people. No? Our main crop is for exportation is coffee, and coffee is produced in these lands. Yeah. So we need to fix the people in these areas legally, but also technically and financially. That is the way we are trying to do right now. No? And agroforestry, I repeat, could be one of our main allies in that. No?
Thanks very much, Gustavo. Yeah. I think clearly from the two presentations, the last two speakers, we're hearing the importance of people and their co-investment in the land if we're going to get this forward. And that is the reason why, Stuart spoke to the promise of agroforestry, of keeping people in the land. And the really important aspect of bringing young people back into agriculture, giving them jobs, giving them opportunities, because we're not just restoring the land, we're not just rehabilitating the land, we're restoring and rehabilitating rural livelihoods, which, with the enormous outflows of migrants from these lands into cities are depleting the opportunity to maintain those lands. I think Ethiopia knows quite a lot about that. Yigamechev, how about your perspectives?
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me as a panel here. I would like to thank ICRAF for that opportunity. The broader perspectives of land degradation was very well addressed by distinguished speakers before us. So I will try to tell you the experiences, the practical experiences from the ground level practices that we have been doing in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a mountainous country where we had a lot of millions of hectares of land that has entirely lost its productivity, and that has resulted in severe damage on our community. That's got a serious concern by the government and the people, and addressing that problem was really a very serious concern and priority in Ethiopian government. To address that, we built on our existing best practices. We relied on 4 important regrading activities in Ethiopia. The first activity that we have employed to address this degraded land restoration activity is exclosure. I would guess most of you know what exclosure is. We employed exclosure in the northern and central highlands of the country. Through exclosure, we were able to restore about 13 million hectares of land. That land, which is restored through exclosure, practically we have demonstrated that it has increased the household income, it has improved the ecosystem services, and it has also increased the resilience of that community. So we have proved that exclosure would work in restoring degraded landscapes in Ethiopia. We will also be heavily relied on exclosure to achieve our pledge. As Lalisa was indicating in his presentation, Ethiopia pledged to restore about 15 million hectares of land. It's not only 15 million hectares of land that we pledged during Bond Challenge. We have also set to manage about 7 million hectares of land in our climate resilient green economy, forest lands. So 7 million hectares of forest land. So this will be an important experience in our future activities in Ethiopia. The other best practice that we employed was tree planting, especially smallholder tree planting. Our farmers, particularly in the northern part, in the northern degraded landscape, used to plant trees as a woodlot, and they could get, they were able to increase their household income, and their livelihood has significantly improved. By now we have about 1.5 million hectares of land under smallholder tree planting. Some of the woods produced from these smallholder tree plantings are exported to our neighboring countries like Sudan. So this has also increased the household income for those people. The other practice was participatory forest management. We have more than 1 million hectares of land under participatory forest management. This participatory forest management has provided a chance to the local community to be engaged in decision making. This has significantly increased our household income because the farmers could collect some non-timber forest products from the natural forest, and they could sell that one. And also, the biodiversity is continuously increasing, and wildlife are also observed in those areas. The number and the diversity of the wildlife in that areas is continuously increasing. So this is also another success story we had, we have been practicing in Ethiopia. Agroforestry is the other practice. Ethiopia is also practicing both conventional, and we do have a lot of traditional agroforestry practices, which are being practiced in Ethiopia. Especially, we have a traditional agroforestry system in our southern part of the country, which have been practiced over the last 500,000 of years. These practices are really helping our community to diversify their products. So the agroforestry practices are providing our farmers feed, fodder, and other several products. So this resulted in diversifying the products and increasing the resilience of the livelihood of the community, as well as the diversity of the ecosystem services they are getting from these practices. Being these are the four major best practices we have, we are now having new targets as a global and national commitment. As Lalisa was also telling us, we are going to restore about 15 million of hectares, and that needs technical and financial capabilities. This is a very, very important factor in our future initiatives. Let me tell you some of the factors that are helping us to be successful in restoring our landscapes.
We may just have time for just one or two factors, because
Okay. I will tell only two or three. Recognizing the restoration in Ethiopia is recognizing as vital. It's not an option. So we must restore our landscapes, otherwise we cannot survive. This is one of our factors. And there was very huge political commitment from our government. That's another factor behind the success of our successful degraded land restoration activities. Thank you very much. I'm done now.
yeah, thank you so much. Thank you very much. And I really do apologize for having to move all of you along. I know you've got lots to offer, but this is the format we're left with. I think there's a story and a picture emerging here which is obvious to all of you, because I suspect we're preaching here to the choir. Productive resilience. Yeah. We need resilient landscapes. They have to be productive. Productive for what? For the people concerned. Sustainability has to be profitable. It has to be beneficial to people. That is the story that is really coming out over here. Just to sort of hark back before I come to the last speaker, who I know is raring to go, to yesterday's side event with Purity. Purity was asked by the president of IFAD and the deputy commissioner for DevCo and EC, so what is it you want, Purity? What is it you need, you and your farmers need? And they were sure, because they were ready to go on this, they were sure what the answer. Her answer, we need motivation. And they said, motivation? I thought you were going to say money. She said, no, I need motivation. I need my farmers to be motivated. Well, the next speaker is probably the most motivational speaker that we've heard. Dennis, you've got 5 minutes to wrap it all up. Then we're going to go back to the audience.
Okay, thank you, Ravi. And I'm really glad to follow Ethiopia, because the question that I wanted to really deal with was, how can agroforestry have massive transformative effects in terms of land restoration, and Ethiopia is doing it. 15 million hectares, it's underway. There are millions of hectares already restored through the enclosure movement. And I think this is my first point, Ravi, that I think the principle is that we've got to take inspiration and lessons from where these transformations have already occurred at huge scale. Mm-hmm. There's many, many examples of small-scale efforts, but now we are able to map and to monitor and to estimate the restoration that has occurred through agroforestry on examples of multi-millions of hectares. If we get that picture in our minds, then we can actually believe that these massive global and national targets are realistic. Without that picture of massive success, we wouldn't have it. Now, Lalisa elegantly pointed out an example from Tanzania. 400,000 hectares were restored through the grazing management systems of the people in northwestern Tanzania. Great example. But the biggest example that we probably can point to anywhere in Africa and probably in most parts of the world has been happening right there in the Sahel, where in the fields and farms of over 1.2 million households in central Niger, they have regenerated over 200 million trees on 5 million hectares over the last 20 years or so. It is an absolutely amazing example, and as we've just published in a new report from the World Bank that has just been released, this is a practice that is not confined to Niger. It's happening on over 500,000 hectares already in Mali, spread to Mali. It's happening in Burkina Faso and in Senegal and other countries in Africa. And it is now clear that this is to be seen as a foundational practice in dryland agriculture in Africa. And this is what has come out in the analysis of the World Bank. What makes it so viral and so possible to scale this practice is that it doesn't require any cash inputs. And my colleague Chris Ray, who's sitting in the back there, has just published a wonderful and elegant analysis of the 6 steps to regreening that covers a distillation of this and many other examples of how, in fact, we can use the best of community approaches and farmer-to-farmer dissemination to reach millions of farmers, as has already been done. Not only that, Ravi, but we just mapped the extent of this practice, farmer-managed natural regeneration, in Malawi, and we found it's happening everywhere in the country, hundreds of thousands of farmers. It was flying under the radar because it wasn't part of a big agricultural development program. It wasn't being actively promoted by Extension. It was being promoted by NGOs, and it went viral. So I think what we have now is a basis for understanding the inspiration. Now we need the political will. And for the political will, we also have to look to countries like Ethiopia. But we can look to the African continent as a whole as well, because just a few weeks ago, the ministers of environment and agriculture got together in Addis Ababa, and they endorsed a target to restore 100 million hectares of land throughout the continent of Africa over the next 15 years. This is an enormous statement of political will, because if you're with us tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., the African Restoration Initiative will be launched, and there will be ministers and permanent secretaries galore who will be declaring their country's commitment to this target. And we expect maybe 30, 40 million hectares of formal commitments already on the table. And so that's political will. We also need more coordinated efforts to build the capacity of organizations who are getting involved in restoration. Let's face it, the technical capacity for agroforestry is usually very, very poor in government extension agencies as well as in NGOs. We need to build that, and that was the basis for our establishing the Evergreen Agriculture Partnership a few years ago. Scale up networks of technical capacity so that we can build the enhanced ability to reach these millions of farmers. My last point is that, yes, progress is being made. But in my view, we are far too timid in our vision, in our science, and in our action. We have got to challenge ourselves boldly to overturn the conventional paradigm of agriculture. That is, crop monoculture segregated from perennials rather than integrated with them. Soon, the issue of a massive redesign and recreation of agriculture will be squarely facing us right in the face. Jim Hansen, the chief scientist at NASA, has just been telling the world that, hey, you've just established a few years ago a target of 2 degrees centigrade. And you're patting yourselves on the back because you're hoping that your process of international negotiations will get you to 2 degrees. Well, my friends, the latest science is that that's far too conservative. He is expecting catastrophic effects above 1 degree, or maybe a little higher than 1 degree, but we're almost there. And the point I want to make is that unless we start thinking of sucking a vast amount of carbon out of the atmosphere, not considering what we're throwing into the atmosphere, we are not going to possibly meet the expectations for avoiding catastrophic climate change. Now, Ravi, we have 1.4 billion hectares of cropland in the world, and if a half a ton of carbon could be sequestered per year on 1.4 billion hectares, well, that's almost 5 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is sucked out of the atmosphere per year. So we've got to think about recreating our agriculture. We've got to think about the ultimate answer of producing our carbohydrates, our starches, and our vegetable proteins, not on annual crops, which aren't helping in terms of carbon sequestration. We've got to produce those starches and proteins on perennials, which can continue to suck carbon out of the atmosphere for many, many decades into the future. Now, Ravi, that would be a real step
Dennis,
forward.
I think we're going to have to stop there.
My last sentence.
All right, okay.
Ravi, that would be a real step forward in transforming our agricultural systems and truly creating an evergreen agriculture.
Right.
I rest my case.
Thank you. So Dennis always has this effect on me. I want to get my pickaxe and hoe and go out there and start planting those perennials. Ladies and gentlemen, don't disappear. This is your chance. So I know I can recognize a whole lot of you who have a lot to say on this issue, who have done a lot of work. It's your opportunity in the next 20 minutes or so to share your thoughts, challenge the panel on anything you think that they misled you on. So we have hopefully people who can go around with microphones. So put your hands up if you've got a question or a comment, and we'll get to you. We'll take 2 or 3 at a time. So we'll start with the lady at the back. Do say what your name is, and then we're going to come here to the gentleman in the white T-shirt and to this gentleman here with the coat on. Very smart-looking gentleman in front here.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Anu, and I'm from India. I have my question, 2 related questions I have. Does agroforestry favor the use of genetically modified organisms or GMOs? Because they have obvious good effects like disease resistance and resistance to pests and low water use. And the second question is specifically related to India, but not limited to India, is that recently, in the recent past, there were many cases of farmer suicides in India, because big agricultural companies like Monsanto or Cargill, they definitely favor the use of GMOs and support sustainable practices for agriculture. But these seeds, they are very expensive for the farmers to buy. And in addition to that, they have to buy expensive pesticides, which are used for these kind of seeds and plantlings. So it is a sort of...
I know we want to give everybody a chance.
Yeah.
I think your point has come across. I think the 2 questions will be taken up by the panel.
Okay.
Thank you. Can we get to this gentleman here with the white T-shirt?
Thank you. My name is Emmanuel from UNEP, and very passionate about young people. Dr. Ravi mentioned about young people and the importance to rehabilitate livelihoods. Now, as a young person and working with young people in agriculture, I tend to think that young people need to find an entry point into agroforestry. Mm-hmm. So how can we make agroforestry attractive to young people, considering that young people are keen about 4 main things, which is having, I'm sorry I have to say this, but 1 wife, 2 children, 2 children means 3-bedroom house, and the 4th means a 4-wheel drive car. So those are the 4 main areas that young people look at. For me to achieve that, can agroforestry be a pathway for me to get that?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And to the handsome gentleman here in front. We'll come back to you in the second round.
Thank you. I am Harry Purnama from C4 Bogor. Just want to ask you about the role of a mid-sized investor. Sometimes the actors of the agroforestry is not the poor farmer, but it's not the poor, but actually the rich people at the local level. They are very active politically and also as organized poor farmers. How then to control, to maximize their roles to restore the landscape. Thank you.
Thank you. And why don't we just give you
I have 3 questions, but one was nicely, no, don't worry, one was already explained, so narrowed down to 2. You were mentioning about the regreening.
Could you just say who you are?
Oh, sorry, my apologies. I'm Michaela, and I'm a student at the University of Copenhagen. I just wanted to comment on Dennis's point on the regreening in the Sahel, which is great. But one of the big issues there is livestock and pastoralism. So I wanted to see maybe the integration or maybe the conflicts that are happening in this area. And then the second question is to do as well with agro-industrial expansion. What are the opportunities as well for agroforestry in these large plantations? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll go back. I mean, some of these are fairly technical agroforestry questions, and I'm not sure who in the panel wants to pick up on them, but we're almost, if somebody could give me a signal whether we've got another 15 minutes, what time are we supposed to stop?
Because we started 15 minutes late.
Well, I don't know. So if we have more time, you know, I would like to go back to the audience. But is there, Dennis, there was one question directly sort of related to you. Let's start with that. And then we can take, maybe Gustavo, you can talk about whether the kind of livelihoods farmers can expect as a result. And then we'll come back to the other panel members. Yeah.
Okay, well, to address the question of agroforestry and GMOs, at the present time, there are no GMO agroforestry technologies that I'm aware of or that are necessarily being developed. There are some GMO technologies in the forestry sector, creating more drought-resistant and, I think, freezing-resistant trees for timber in some countries, but in agroforestry we haven't gotten engaged in the research on GMOs. As to the interesting question about the role of these regreening processes in the grazing systems, you know, 20 years ago, most of the professionals in the Sahel never thought that this regeneration could happen. This is what's so interesting. If you were around before this happened, you were subjected to the skepticism that it could never happen because of the conflicts with grazers. But in fact, the Nigerian people, through their community organizations and their farm organizations, negotiated solutions to create a win-win solution so that both the grazers made out well because of the increased fodder for livestock in the dry season from the trees, as well as the farmers made out because their crops yielded more and their soil fertility increased. So that was a very interesting case of that old Mandela quote that, you know, you never believe what will happen until it actually happens. And then all of a sudden you have a tipping point, and what was total conventional wisdom has been turned on its head in the Sahel. And I hope we can do that in many other places in the world.
Thank you. So I've just been told we've got about 10 minutes more. So I'm going to hold back with the panel for a last thought, and I'm going to come back to the audience. So quickly, please, gentlemen with the checked shirt first, and then we'll go through and take all your comments. But let's give everybody a chance. So we'll try and go quickly. And panelists, very short summing up thoughts to close off with.
My name is Per Angelstam from Sweden. And when you think about all these actions, there are three important words: pressure, response, and state. The pressure environments are quite easy to monitor. You can look at remote sensing, you can look at degradation. But when we think about responses, we often talk about plants, planted trees, but what is actually the net of pressure and response on the state? And I think we need to know, we talked about scaling up and so on, but what are the ways of actually assessing progress on the ground, both in the ecological system and social systems?
Thank you. Very clear. We had the lady first. We'll just go through, Peter, row after row, those who raised their hands, and then...
Thank you. My name is Jennifer Schulz. I'm a landscape planner, postdoc also at the University of Potsdam in Germany. And I've been working with agroforestry on the ground for 10 years and landscape restoration planning. And I'm really wondering how to go forward in terms of large-scale restoration planning or organization of these processes. Because on the one hand, we need all these participatory processes. On the other hand, we need biophysically adapted, let's say, plant zoning. So I think I'm really struggling where are the solutions of how to find both ways, knowledge from technical side and input from the stakeholders and the knowledge from the ground, and whether there are good examples of how these two things have been brought together.
Great,
Thanks.
thank you. So as you pass there's actually, if you go, there's an app called Agroforestry Tree Finder. Colleagues of mine have got climate proof, so you can go anywhere in Africa and find out what the relevant trees are. So we've actually got a lot of technology. Please, the gentleman there.
Yeah, I'm Bastian Laumann from CATI in Costa Rica. Actually, thank you very much for your very interesting presentations. We heard a lot from Africa, yeah, but we learned a lot, but I also got more confused. So you're talking a lot about the local experiences, that the farmers are actually doing it themselves. Well, we are a research organization. What should we be doing? What can we do to actually contribute to that? Do we have a role, or should we just try and promote that they do it themselves?
Thank you. So we pass it on very, very quickly. We're going to run out. I think we've got two more we can take, and then we've got to close this. So we'll give the gentleman and then the lady at the back, and then we'll come back to the panel for 30-second answers, please. Please.
Thank you. My name is Martin Arnoux. I'm working in Morocco with the rural communities, working on many subjects, mostly about soil restoration. I have a question, maybe a naive question for Denise. I really totally join your perennial agriculture need that you talked about. So in my case, working with these communities, the government is far away from understanding or having any will going towards that direction. So simply how to start that kind of process in that kind of context.
Thank you for that question. It's a great question, but Dennis is not going to be able to answer it in the 30 seconds. I suggest you catch him before he leaves the room, tie him down, because he'll tell you this for an hour.
Thank you. I'm Lily Rodriguez from the University of Bonn. And I'm a bit confused about the Peruvian strategy that mentioned that there is 80% of forests standing over forestry or conservation areas and worry about the other 20%. And that is one of my questions. The other one is, how do you harmonize with, for instance, the Aichi targets and all the other strategies? And for Ethiopia, I would like to know how you do this scaling up. This is a very interesting point, I think.
Thank you very much. No, I'm sorry, we're out of time. I would have loved to stay here the rest of the day. I don't think any of the other sessions are as important as this one, but unfortunately I'm alone in thinking that. I'm going to hand this back to the panelists for quick answers. You don't have to answer each of the questions. You're summing up in an answer, all in 30 seconds.
Per question.
Per summing up.
Very quickly, not to waste. So on Anu's point and Emmanuel's point, the issue of farmer suicide is, I don't think it's just driven by, it reflects that farmers are in very precarious situations. In North Wales, upland sheep farmers have also got a very high rate of suicide. I think it reflects the precariousness of the situation, the lack of diversity on farming systems that actually cut down options. What we actually see by diversifying systems and by helping farmers move from subsistence to be actually have